Okay, as we mentioned, there is software on these switches and devices. And because of that, similar to a computer, well, it is a computer, it's got to load that software up. So we're going to talk about the boot up process, what the boot up process looks like. We'll take a look at the booting up process as a whole, and then we're going to get down into the individual parts of it, like the Bootstrap part of it. We're going to talk about configuration registry values and how it determines where it looks for the iOS, and talk about how it locates the iOS. We'll talk about ROMMON and what that is, and then we'll wrap things up talking about the configuration file, just a brief introduction about the configuration files. So as your device, when you turn on the device, the steps it takes to get everything up and running is that first of all, it goes through a post or a power on self-test. This is similar to a computer where it starts testing its equipment to make sure everything is functioning as it should during this process. And then next what it'll do is it will load the Bootstrap program or the bootloader program in order to make its next steps, to take its next steps. Then it goes into the iOS, locating the iOS and loading the iOS. And then finally, we get into the configuration of the device and loading the configuration up. Okay, once it's done the power on self-test, now it goes to the Bootstrap program or the bootloader program. The Bootstrap program is a program that it loads and starts executing on to get all the gears in motion. So it's a real basic set of instructions on just getting things up and going, doing a few more basic tests and initializing memory and finding and locating the iOS, and then starting to load the iOS up in the system and executing the iOS. So it's the Bootstrap program is the thing that kind of kicks things off and gets the motion going with all the software that needs to be set up on this device to make sure it's running and functioning correctly. All right, so during this Bootstrap process, it's going to take a look at the configuration register value. The configuration register value is just a simple little hexadecimal number that's in there that's going to represent what this device is supposed to do during startup. What I mean by that is, let me just give you an example. When we take a look at it, you'll see it starts with a 0x, and then there'll be a 21, and let's say it says 00. That's a flag that says, oh, you need to go into ROMMON mode, and we'll talk about ROMMON more in here in a bit. If it sees a 0x 101, it's going to go into RX boot. If it sees 0x 21 02, then it's going to load the iOS. And in fact, actually, if we can specify which iOS it loads by 21, 02, 03, 04, anything up to F. So up to 21. 0F is going to specify certain iOSs to load. And then another one that I'll mention here is 2142, and 2142 then gets into, it loads the iOS, but it does not load the configuration file. And the advantage of that is since the password's in the configuration file, it's a way to bypass, if you've got access to the equipment, it would be a way to bypass the password and get into your device. And you can, so that way you can then get into this. If you lost your password for some reason, you can still get into the device and fix it. But we'll talk more about that later. Just know that this Bootstrap program looks for the configuration register value to find out what it should be doing to get this device up and running. So during that Bootstrap program, what it's going to do is it's going to locate that iOS, and then in this stage, it actually loads that iOS and gets that device up and running on that iOS, whatever iOS it finds. If none is specified, there are times when you don't specify an iOS, then what it's just going to do is it's going to look up into its file system and find the first available, and it's alphabetical, and it'll find the first available iOS to load, and that's what it's going to load. So I briefly mentioned ROMMON mode. There's ways to get into ROMMON mode by changing the configuration value, or there's also certain things that you can do during the startup process of this device to get into ROMMON mode. So what is ROMMON mode? So ROMMON mode it's a really basic set. You can think of it maybe a little like BIOS, where you get into BIOS and there's some diagnostics that you can run, or if you need to get into there to change the configuration value, then that way you can boot up without it loading the configs, or so there's some certain basic commands and certain things you can do. I've even seen where a student will wipe the iOS off of a device, and now it can't even start up into the iOS, and then it will go into ROMMON mode, and then you have to use the commands within ROMMON mode to get a new iOS on that device so you can at least get it started and get it functioning again. All right, then we have the config. So as soon as we've got this iOS loaded up in the machine, as long as we've said not to bypass this config, it will look for that config and load that config. So it's looking for the startup dash config, and once it gets that, then it's going to load it up into the RAM. It becomes the startup dash config, and then it will use that for all of its functionality. If it doesn't, then it goes into a setup mode, and we'll talk more about the setup mode later. But that is the configuration file, and we're going to be talking a little more about the configuration files here in just a little bit. All right, so there you have it. We talked about that boot up process. Then we got specifically into the Bootstrap and that software that gets everything kicked off and locates the iOS. For the Bootstrap to know what to do and what steps it should take, it takes a look at that configuration registry value, and that configuration registry value lets it know whether it needs to go into ROMMON mode or whether it needs to locate the iOS and where that location would be at, or maybe it needs to bypass the configuration file. Don't forget to hit that like button. Thank you. Then we talked about how it locates the iOS. I did forget to mention that the iOS could be on Flash, could be on, it could exist on multiple locations, and so it has to locate that iOS. And then the ROMMON, it gets into that's a basic command set to do some basic troubleshooting and do some basic commands on that switch in case something happens and you need to be able to really get to the core of it and make some alterations to it. And then we talked about the configuration file, which we'll get much more in depth into in a couple of videos from now.